Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexandru Cernat. I'm the chair of the Social Statistics Committee at the Royal Statistical Society. And it's my great pleasure to organize this event today, looking at panel conditioning in surveys. Unfortunately, we have a change in program, so the first speaker cannot make it due to personal reasons, so Bella will not be here today. But Ruben has kindly agreed to do double duty. So what he'll do is first give a short presentation, kind of an overview, what is panel conditioning, what are the issues, and discuss a little bit about ways in which we can estimate that. And then we go to our regular program with presentation from Fabienne, Ruben, and Florian. And the way we set it up is after each presentation, we'll have time for a very short question if there are questions about kind of clarification. And then at the end, we'll have time for kind of a debate and a panel thinking, what did we learn from this and next steps and things like that. So kind of, yeah, I think if you have quick questions, we can do them after each talk. Otherwise, let's try to have a longer discussion at the end. Also, I should say that this will be recorded. So we'll, after a while, we'll put it on YouTube. And I hope that's okay. If you have issues with that, maybe you can close the video and rename yourself, or whatever you need to do to feel comfortable during this this event. So with that out of the way, Ruben, would you kindly do your first presentation?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right, I hope you can see my presentation. Perfect. Okay, yeah, my name is Ruben Bach. I'm a computational social scientist at the University of Mannheim in Germany, and I will give a very general introduction to panel conditioning and especially the challenges when it comes to uncovering such effects in panel surveys. And yeah, to get started, what is panel conditioning? Panel conditioning usually refers to the phenomenon whereby respondents' reporting of behavior or their actual behavior, attitudes, and/or knowledge are changed due to repeated participation in a panel survey. I think Bella wanted to talk about panel conditioning in other forms of data. Maybe we can have something in the discussion about that. And I think Florian will also talk about panel conditioning effects in novel data formats. But here I will focus on the more traditional survey data. So we have changes in respondents' behavior, changes in the reporting of behavior, attitudes, and knowledge. And they are only due to being repeatedly interviewed in a panel survey. And it is problematic because the implicit assumption that we usually make in survey research or in basically any kind of research is that the act of measuring does not change what is being measured. And thinking about this in terms of surveys, well, we ask questions to people, they give us answers, and we do not expect that just asking them questions about certain behaviors or attitudes will result in changes in those behaviors or attitudes. But unfortunately, in some cases, that can be the case. Consequences that arise from these different forms of panel conditioning. On the one hand, if we have changes in reporting, that means the quality of reports changes over time. It doesn't mean that the quality has to become worse. It can also mean that the quality of reports becomes better. Nonetheless, both forms of changes in measurement error better or worse would result in spurious change over time that is due to survey participation only. And it would mess with the longitudinal data and the changes over time that we are usually interested in when we collect and analyze panel survey data, because it would be spurious change and not change due to some external factors or internal changes in respondents that we want to uncover. If you have changes in behavior, attitudes, and knowledge, well, the problem is somewhat similar, but a little bit different. Here, the issue is that once respondents' behavior changes due to panel conditioning or being repeatedly interviewed, then their behavior is no longer representative of the target population. We have the same issue. We also have spurious change over time. But again, in addition, we have the problem that those who have been interviewed a couple of times are no longer representative of the target population. And well, this is a huge problem for survey research. To give you some examples on the different forms of panel conditioning, changes in reporting. On the one hand, we have explanations or mechanisms that result in respondents becoming better reporters, so measurement error decreases. Explanations or hypotheses for these kind of effects come, for example, from respondents developing more trust in the survey and interview process, or they get a better understanding of the survey questions, and several other explanations. Some examples: more honest reporting of socially undesirable behavior, for example, income reports, more honest reports of life satisfaction, and there are many other studies that have looked at this. There's also evidence for respondents becoming worse reporters. So we have an increase in measurement error because they give worse responses over time. And here motivations can be, for example, that respondents want to reduce the duration of the survey. They learn how the survey is structured, and then they learn to give answers that would reduce the overall length of the survey, for example, by giving certain answers to filter questions. Evidence for this kind of reporting, for example, found in straightlining, social desirability bias, misreporting of unemployment status in the current population survey in the US. There's actually a lot of research on this survey, and there the mechanism goes: people report in wave 2, wave 3, wave 4, and so on, to be out of the labor force instead of being unemployed, because then they don't have to answer additional questions about their unemployment status. If they say I'm out of the labor force, they just don't get additional questions, and they want to reduce the burden. And so there are misreports and biased estimation of unemployment rates in this current population survey in the US. Changes in behavior. We have cognitive stimulation explanations. That means if we ask respondents questions about certain behaviors, that can motivate them to take up these behaviors, for example. And evidence here comes from election studies, where we see that after being interviewed about voting behavior, there is increased voter turnout. There's also evidence from I think it's Dutch data by Tom Crossley and colleagues, who found that being even once interviewed about saving behavior for retirement makes you more likely to save more for retirement. And then labor market behavior, the study that I will present later on. Now, the challenges when it comes to analyzing these kind of effects are that, well, panel survey participation can affect both respondents' reporting of behavior and the behavior itself. So how do we know whether respondents' actual behavior changed or whether they just tell us that their behavior changed? So we need to disentangle these two forms of panel conditioning effects. Second issue is we need good control group data of people who have not been interviewed. So if you think about this in kind of an experimental setting. We have our treatment group, that is people who have been interviewed multiple times. Now we need data of people who have not been interviewed multiple times or only once. And the challenge is that we have, say, panel attrition effects. Sometimes we have mode changes across those who have been interviewed multiple times, and we need to disentangle these confounding sources of error, this third challenge. And actually, in the past, a lot of studies had difficulties addressing these challenges adequately. And I just want to go through some examples how to address them from a methodological side. So point one, panel survey participation can affect both respondents' reporting of behavior and the behavior itself. One solution could be to use behavioral records of behavioral records that are independent of respondents' reporting. So say you have a survey and you have some administrative data, but some of the variables that you ask in the survey are also measured, then you can use the admin data as kind of gold standard because they are unaffected of respondents' reporting. And if you look only at the admin records, then you could say, well, this is a change in behavior effect. And there might be theoretical considerations that you say, well, one of the two is very unlikely. Say, if you ask questions in the consumer expenditure survey, people are asked like how much they spend for a different type of expenses, and it is from a theoretical side very unlikely that that changes all of them. And so maybe you can say, well, this is just changes in reporting of behavior. Control group data. Well, we need data of people who have not been interviewed or who have been interviewed only once. And a solution could be we can make within person comparisons. So we compare the same people over time. We take their first wave data and then data from when they have been interviewed multiple times and have been potentially subject to this panel conditioning. The problem here is that we need to account for true change in the outcome over time. And again, this is not always easy to do. It does work, for example, when we have measurement error studies, so changes in reporting, because we could say, well, we look at measurement error in the first wave, we look at measurement error in later waves, and we could probably argue that it makes sense that only respondents' experience or tenure in the panel has changed, but not anything else which would affect their measurement error. And finally, we can also have between person comparisons, which means instead of comparing the same people over time, we have some people who have been interviewed once and others who have been interviewed multiple times. One approach would be we randomize respondents into groups with different levels of survey exposure and then compare them. We can ask those that we want to use as the control group only some placebo questions. The challenge again would be we need to assume that placebo questions don't have effects themselves, or we compare two surveys with a very similar or even identical content. So say a cross-sectional survey and a longitudinal survey, but then we need to make additional assumptions about the two surveys being really comparable. And the last point, which is very helpful if you have a panel survey with a rotating design, because what we can do here is we can use different groups, rotation groups, and compare their responses and behavior at different points in time. So say we have two rotation groups and three-wave panel, and they are kept for 2 weeks, for 2 waves in the panel. Then we could say we take the second wave of the first rotation group and compare it with the second wave, which is the first interview wave of the second rotation group. And because we know that they will that they also participate in wave 3, we can account for panel attrition. So we use the data from 3 waves and then we compare the data exactly at the point where we know that panel attrition won't affect won't affect these two groups. And then finally, we need to account for other sources of error. We have panel attrition, what I already mentioned. Sometimes we have mode or interviewer effects, which change over the course of a panel survey. Sometimes we have dependent interviewing. And all of these effects are things that can result in change in, for example, measurement error over time that we may mistake for panel conditioning. And so we need to account for them. And usually the solution here would be we restrict our data or analysis sample to respondents who have not experienced mode changes, who have always been interviewed by the same interviewer, who were not subject to dependent interviewing and the like. And to control for panel attrition, we can use this rotating design if our survey of interest used one, or we can restrict our survey to non-tritting respondents, or can use an instrumental variable approach, which I will present in the study later on. Yeah, so brief summary, there are three major challenges when analyzing panel condition effects, and it's not always easy to tackle all of them. We don't always have admin data, for example. We don't always have a rotating design. Accounting for panel attrition is not always very easy, and often we need to make a lot of assumptions. We should be very open about the assumptions that we make. And unfortunately, in the literature so far, many studies had found it somewhat difficult to address them adequately, but in the recent past, considerable progress has been made. And yeah, if you want to read more on this methodological framework for understanding panel conditioning, there's a chapter in a book edited by Alex and Joe Sackstock on measurement error and longitudinal data, where I go into much more detail on this topic.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for saving the day and giving a really good introduction to panel conditioning. So any quick questions for clarification before we move to the next presentation? Like I said, at the end, we'll have more time for questions and for a panel discussion. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat if, put the question in the chat if anything comes up. Okay, if not, I think we can move to the second presentation. So our next presenter is Fabienne, who comes from GESIS. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. I will just quickly share my slides. I hope you can see them now. Okay, yeah. Perfect. So yes, welcome everyone to my talk. Today I'm presenting joint work with my colleagues of a DFG-funded project on panel conditioning. And we investigated satisficing response behavior across time with the help of a longitudinal survey experiment. And to start right into it, I initially wanted to present some background information on panel conditioning, but since Ruben gave this excellent introduction, I will just skip mostly of the information. What I just want to particularly focus on is the differentiation between two types of learning, which is relevant for the present study, and that is the differentiation between process learning and content learning. So maybe a general reminder for some of you, or maybe a completely new information, but respondents can either become familiar with the general survey process or with the general procedure of being surveyed, which is then referred to as process learning, or they can become familiar with specific question content when they are repeatedly asked the same questions or identical questions, which is then called content learning. And yeah, as I said, this differentiation is particularly relevant for the present study. Also, yeah, the rest of the information is I think mostly repetition, but like we know that these changes due to previous survey participation can occur if you look at the previous studies or at the previous research on panel conditioning. Those changes in response behavior are mostly due to three major theoretical mechanisms, and that is either reflection processes, a changing social desirability bias, or survey satisficing strategies. And since we are looking into survey satisficing in this study, just a short recap what survey satisficing is, or the concept of survey satisficing. So it describes mental shortcuts in the response process to reduce cognitive effort and survey burden. And there are plenty of different satisficing response strategies. The ones that we are focusing, or the ones that we focused on in the present study, are first selecting the first response options, which is also called primacy effect. Second, selecting don't know options instead of a substantial answer. And third, agreeing with statements, which is also referred to acquiescence. And previous research on satisficing in general has extensively shown that it has negative consequences for response quality, and that certain respondent characteristics can also influence the extent of satisficing. I think the most important ones are probably cognitive ability and motivation. And starting from this, or that being said, we wanted to see, or we looked at satisficing in a longitudinal context and saw that there's only little research on the consequences of satisficing on the response quality in later waves of panel studies. So what we saw that the few studies that did exist only addressed a few selected satisficing indicators, so many other satisficing indicators remained unaddressed. And also what we saw is that the existing studies showed mixed findings. So in particular, we saw increases versus non-significant change in straightlining as one satisficing indicator, and motivated misreporting as another satisficing indicator. What we additionally saw was that most studies that exist are non-experimental. And now when we think back of what I just mentioned regarding the differentiation between content learning and process learning, so since most studies are non-experimental, it is not quite clear which underlying learning mechanism is actually responsible for a change across waves, if we see one at all. Okay, so starting from this, we wanted to investigate with a longitudinal survey experiment, does satisficing increase or decrease across panel waves? Then regarding the underlying learning mechanisms, we wanted to see, is content learning, so really repeatedly answering identical questions and learning the question content, is content learning responsible for a change in satisficing across panel waves? And then lastly, which moderators play a role in that? So do different panel intervals, respondents' cognitive ability, or respondent motivation affect the change in satisficing that we see across waves? To investigate this further, we set up two main hypotheses. The first one would be that when answering identical questions multiple times, respondents show changes in their level of satisficing across waves. So irrespective of whether they show a decrease or increase, we expected to see some kind of change across panel waves. With regard to our second hypothesis, we stated that the changes in satisficing across panel waves that occurred are caused by content learning. So they are caused by respondents repeatedly answering identical questions. And that might either be because the act of repeatedly answering identical questions over and over again either decreases their motivation in the long run, which would then lead to an increased level of satisficing, or what we also assumed was that when respondents repeatedly answer identical questions, that might somehow decrease task difficulty, and this might maybe even lead to a decreased level of satisficing over time. With regard to the moderators, we expected that the change in satisficing across panel waves that is caused by, again, content learning, by repeatedly answering the identical questions, can be decreased by a longer panel interval, by higher cognitive abilities, and high respondent motivation. So that was really based on prior research, which has shown cognitive abilities and respondent motivation to affect the extent of satisficing, and longer panel intervals to decrease the effects of panel conditioning. Then onto the data, we use data of a German non-probability panel study, which drew on a quota sample that was based on age, gender, and education. In total, the study comprised 6 panel waves, which were fielded from October 2020 to December 2021. Another specific thing about our study was that we had 2 panel intervals. So respondents were either surveyed monthly, which we refer to as the short panel interval, or they were surveyed about every 3 months, so within a longer interval. And to account for panel attrition, our analytic sample only referred to respondents who participated in all panel waves. And then additionally to our non-probability panel study, we also used a probability-based mixed mode panel study, namely the GESIS panel, as a benchmark study. So additionally to the non-probability study, we used a benchmark probability-based study for the extent of satisficing. And here we used data from a wave that was fielded from February to March 2014, and which used the same measures to measure satisficing that we did, but I will come to that later on. First of all, I want to give an overview of our rather complicated design. So first off, we had several randomization levels in our study. The first randomization level I just briefly mentioned, which was that we randomly assigned respondents to either being surveyed monthly, which was within a short interval, or they were randomly assigned to being surveyed within a longer interval between panel waves, which was about 3 months. And then starting from that on, we had our more or less relevant experimental manipulation, which was that we manipulated the frequency with which identical question content was asked. So we randomly assigned respondents to either a conditioned group, which received identical target questions, so identical question content in each of the 6 panel waves, or respondents were assigned to an unconditioned group, which received those those target questions, as we named it, in the last wave of the study. And before that, they received varying questions on different topics. So if this would not be enough, we had a third randomization level, which then on top of that manipulated the question design of the administered target questions. And here to say is that this random assignment of question design was conducted with every panel wave. So a respondent did not necessarily receive question design version A in every panel wave, but it could be completely random what they received throughout the study. And we did this to basically measure satisficing. So this manipulation of question design was targeted at measuring satisficing response behavior of the respondents. Again, the measures, I think I already briefly mentioned it before. We focused on 3 satisficing indicators, which was primacy effects, acquiescence, and saying don't know. And to measure them, we administered 6 question design experiments in total, 2 of them manipulating the response order, 2 manipulating whether the question was displayed in an agree-disagree format or construct-specific format. And lastly, 2 manipulating the inclusion of a don't know option. And to give some short examples of how the question design experiments looked like, first of all, I think this is quite straightforward. The response order experiment that dealt with, I think, provision of adequate housing. So ask respondents whether they think the state or an individual should take care of adequate housing. And here you can see, quite straightforward. In version A, the option that the state should provide adequate housing appears first. The option that the individual should take care of housing appears second, and in version B, we see that this response order is just reversed. So I think quite straightforward. And here the assumption would be that respondents tend to choose the first response option irrespective of the content, which is already, I think, quite popular as primacy effects. The second type of experiment, acquiescence experiments, is maybe not so straightforward. Here we see that in version A, we gave respondents a statement to which they either were asked to agree or disagree. And then in version B, this statement that was given in version A was part of the response options that were offered to the respondents. So here we can see in version A, respondents were asked to agree with the statement, most men are emotionally better suited for politics than most women. So they were asked to agree or disagree with that. And in version B, it was like explicitly one of the three response options that respondents could choose from. And here the assumption would be that respondents tend to simply agree with statements, also referred to acquiescence. And then lastly, the don't know experiments. Again, I think this is quite straightforward. So in version A, we offered a don't know option to the respondents, and in version B, there was no explicit don't know option offered. And here we assume that respondents tend to say don't know instead of giving a substantial answer if they are explicitly offered a don't know option. Okay, then on to the moderators. Just very briefly, I think I've said this enough. The panel interval, we measured this by respondents surveying either monthly or about 2 to 3 months between the panel waves. Then with regard to respondents' cognitive ability, we used 2 measures for that. We for once used actual cognitive performance in a cognitive reflection task. And second, we used education in terms of high school leaving certificate. And then with regard to respondents' motivation, we used mean scores of need for cognition. Okay, then on to our analytic strategy. First and foremost, to just initially investigate the existence and extent of response effects in each panel wave. We simply conducted chi-square and Fisher's exact tests. And then to test our hypothesis, we kind of like had 2 different approaches of statistic modeling. So for once, we conducted analysis for each question design experiment separately. Amongst them were random effects models to estimate the change across waves and logistic regression models comparing the conditioned and unconditioned respondents. And then as a second approach to statistic modeling, we kind of combined the 6 question design experiments within one general measure of satisficing response behavior per respondent. So the question design experiments were nested within persons. And for this, we conducted multi-level logistic regression models. Okay, so on to the results. First of all, the response order experiments. Here, as an example, the first response order experiment again that addressed adequate housing. And here, first of all, focusing on wave 1, we see that there is a significant primacy effect in wave 1. So we see that respondents choose response options based on the order in which they are shown, irrespective of the content. And we see that the primacy effect in the non-probability panel is is somewhat larger than the one that we found in the probability-based benchmark study. But in both studies, we see significant and considerably large primacy effects in the first wave of the study. Then if we look at the primacy effect across waves in our non-probability panel study, we see that in each wave, we find significant primacy effects that are also considerably large. But what we do see is it might appear that primacy effects decrease across waves, but statistically looking at it, we did not find a significant change across waves. And when I will go on and we will look at the other experiments, I think I can already give a preview on this. We also did not find a clear pattern of increase or decrease. But yeah, let's move on to, first of all, the comparison of conditioned and unconditioned respondents. So again, maybe to remember, the conditioned respondents received identical questions in every wave of the study, and the unconditioned respondents only received these target questions, as we named them in the last in the last wave of the study. And here we also see that the unconditioned respondents also showed a significant and considerable large primacy effect in the in the last wave of the study, but like when we combine these two respondent groups, we do not see that they differ in the extent of primacy effect. Okay, so moving on to the acquiescence experiment, here we see like a quite similar picture. Again, focusing on wave 1, we find significant and considerably large acquiescence bias within the first panel wave for the non-probability panel, as well as for the probability-based benchmark study. I think again here we see that in the non-probability panel, the acquiescence bias is somewhat larger than in the probability-based benchmark study. But again, we see a response effect in both studies that is significant. Then when we look at it again across waves, quite similar pictures. For most of the waves, we do find a significant acquiescence bias. Quite considerably large, but again, I think here it is more obvious. We do not see a clear pattern of increase or decrease, and again, statistically looking at it, we did not find a significant change across waves in the extent of acquiescence bias. And then again, looking at it at the comparison of conditioned and unconditioned respondents, here it might seem at first glance that there is a difference, but looking at it statistically, the difference was still not significant. So the unconditioned respondents were not significantly different in their acquiescence bias than the conditioned respondents who received identical questions throughout the panel study. And then lastly, looking at our don't know experiment, here again, similar picture. In wave 1, we again see significant response effects. So respondents who were explicitly offered a don't know option also chose it more often. The thing that is different here is that in the non-probability panel, we see a much smaller response effect than in the probability-based benchmark study. So here it's kind of reversed. But again, it's significant, it is there. And when we look at it across waves in our non-probability panel study, quite similar picture. In each wave, we find significant response effects, but again, no clear pattern of increase or decrease. And again, we do not find significant changes across the waves. Same for the comparison of conditioned and unconditioned respondents. Again, here we did not find a significant difference in the extent of response effect between those two respondent groups. And moving on to the multi-level models, again, this is where we model the 6 different question design experiments within one general measure of satisficing response behavior. And here we again see, okay, this question design effect exists. So we have response effects, even when we are considering respondent characteristics or the panel interval, those question design effects still exist. So we have satisficing in the data, but the hypothesis that we stated, none of them could be supported. So we do not see that content learning is responsible for a change. So we do not see a difference between those respondents who received identical questions throughout the study and those who did not. We do not see an effect of panel interval. We do not see an effect of cognitive performance or education, and no significant effect of motivation. Okay, so summing up, exactly like I think I just mentioned, is that our assumptions, first of all, the change in level of satisficing across waves, we could not find evidence for significant change across waves. We could not find evidence that an underlying learning mechanism of content learning causes these changes in satisficing, as the two respondent groups were not significantly different from each other. Also, we could not find evidence that a longer panel interval decreases this change in satisficing caused by content learning. We could also not find evidence for higher cognitive abilities or higher respondent motivation to have an effect on the extent of satisficing across waves. Okay, so what can we conclude from this? Again, we did not find evidence of panel conditioning causing changes in satisficing across waves, but what we do see repeatedly is that the panel data is considerably affected by satisficing, with effect sizes that range up to 15 percentage points or more. So the response effects were considerably large. Also, what we see is that taking all of these 6 question design experiments together, the extent of satisficing in the non-probability panel is similar to the probability-based benchmark study. If we again look at it on an average for all of the 6 question design experiments, and what we also see is that some question designs are problematic and foster the occurrence of satisficing. So if we think back of the agree-disagree response formats, those clearly foster the occurrence of satisficing instead of just displaying a question in a construct-specific format. And maybe as an outlook, what we could give as a takeaway message is that survey practitioners should closely monitor satisficing in their panel studies, focusing on problematic question designs, as it does not appear that respondents who stay within the panel for a longer time change it. So we still see high response effects, high extent of satisficing in later panel waves. And maybe the implementation of such question design experiments could be part of a general data quality reporting and could allow to quantify the extent of satisficing in the data. So to better keep track of how the data is actually affected by satisficing. Yeah, and that it would be from my side. Thank you everybody for your attention.
Excellent, very nice. Yeah, I really like the design. It's kind of cool to see that you implement some of the things that Ruben was talking about and really try to create experiments to look at particular type of errors. So I really enjoyed that. So any quick questions before we go to the next talk? Okay, if not, we'll have time for more questions at the end. So I have 1 or 2 questions that I would like to discuss, but we can wait towards the end. So thank you so much. Ruben, do you want to go next? Are you ready for the second round?
Yes, so let me share my screen again. Oops, sorry. Okay. All right, so yeah, round 2. I already teased this study. It's about the question whether participation in a panel survey on labor market outcomes and labor market behavior changes respondents, and to put in here actual behavior. And that is a study I did together with Stephanie Ekman from RTI. I think she actually changed jobs. Maybe that's no longer accurate. Yeah, we already talked a lot about panel conditioning. So I just want to come back to this point that repeated interviewing can change both behavior and the reporting of behavior, because this is central to this study. We will focus on behavior, and we have a design which allows us to make sure that the effects that we identify do not identify changes in the reporting of behavior, but really changes in actual behavior, because a short spoiler, we have administrative labor market data that we match to panel survey data, and we look at behavior in the administrative labor market data, which was collected after survey participation. And by that, we can rule out that people just told us their behavior changed, and find real changes in behavior panel conditioning effects. The question here is, I already mentioned that the repeated participation in a long-running labor market panel study, labor market and social security, or short PASS. It's a German acronym for Panel Arbeitsmarkt und Soziale Sicherung. So it's a German labor market study, change respondents' labor market behavior. And the hypothesis here is we want to focus on this cognitive stimulation idea, because we have a survey, respondents repeatedly participated in the survey, and they were always asked questions about certain behaviors. And we hypothesize here that asking people questions about these behaviors worked as a cognitive stimulus, which made them become more aware of the behaviors and eventually led to behavioral changes. And since we already talked about the other mechanisms, I will just skip that. Some examples of panel conditioning, I already mentioned some earlier, and Fabienne talked a little bit about examples. I just want to mention again, there are a few studies that found actual changes in behavior. Some of them, for example, this Crossley study, which I already mentioned, linked survey data to administrative data. In that case, it was, I think, tax records and survey data in the Netherlands. I think Netherlands, or yeah. Then when we have a voter turnout, we can link survey data to actual voter registration files. And for these more marketing-oriented studies, well, there are surveys conducted among customers, and then their purchasing behavior, for example, can be observed as well. Examples of panel conditioning. In terms of reporting of behavior, we already talked about that. I just want to highlight here to emphasize this point that in a labor market context, panel survey participation can bring about changes in respondents' behavior and their reporting of behavior. Again, this study by Harper, Manus, and Warren conducted in the US with the current population survey, which found that seemingly labor market behavior was affected by panel survey participation, but here it's actually the reporting of behavior. And in our study, we focus on the actual actual labor market behavior. And so we kind of know that disentangling changes in reporting and changes in actual behavior is crucial here. The hypothesis, I already mentioned that, but I want to go a little bit more into details here. The German panel on labor market outcomes and labor market behavior contains a few questions regarding respondents' participation in active labor market policies. And so what are active labor market policies? If you're not a labor economist, you probably haven't heard of this term. It's just those are like government programs designed to support people looking for a job in finding a job. So in resuming work, that is application trainings, language courses, computer courses, and all these kind of things. And the survey, the panel survey that we analyzed here contains questions about respondents' participation in these measures. And so we thought, well, maybe this is some form of cognitive simulation. So we have people who are eligible to participate in these programs. They are on a yearly basis, PAS is administered on a yearly basis, but I'll come back to that. They are asked questions about their participation in these measures, which may make it easier for them to find a new job. So we really thought, well, there's some reason to be concerned that this could result in changes in behavior panel conditioning. And the direction that we hypothesized was that we thought, well, it would lead respondents to become more likely to engage in these labor market programs once they have answered several waves of the survey. And well, again, methodological challenge here is, on the one hand, we need to distinguish between changes in behavior and changes in reporting of behavior. And I already mentioned we use admin data for that, linked to survey data. But then the second challenge here is that we need to adjust for other confounding effects that we might easily be mistaken for panel conditioning. So first of all, we have panel attrition. We look at several waves of panel survey data, and as you all know, respondents tend to, or some respondents tend to at some point drop out of panel survey participation. Now, the problem is that when we take data from wave 2, from wave 3, then the sample is no longer representative of the target population due to this non-random panel attrition process. And we will see later why this is challenging in our study here. Then we have interview effects. Interview effect in terms of especially when interviewers change. So maybe you have one interviewer in the first wave, but another one in the second wave. We know that the gender of an interviewer can have effects on your reporting behavior, for example. And then mode effects. Some surveys use, say, telephone interviewing in the first wave, and then they go to paper and pencil or mail surveys in subsequent waves, or online interviewing modes. And we need to account for all these potential sources of error or methodological artifacts in our data. And before I come to the design and how we tackle those challenges specifically here, I want to give some more information about the panel study. It's a yearly household panel study on labor market topics conducted by the German Institute for Employment Research, which is a large national research institute on labor market topics in Germany, and it's closely connected to the Federal Employment Agency, or the Public Employment Services in Germany. And that makes it really interesting because they have access to administrative labor market data that is produced as a byproduct of the employment agencies' everyday activities, interacting with unemployed people, with people receiving unemployment benefits, with people looking for a job, with people being put in labor market programs and the like. And that makes it a very good institution to do this kind of research. Now, the panel originally consists of 2 subsamples. We have a general population sample, but we will exclude that here because the other sample is way more interesting for us. It's a sample of unemployment benefit recipients. About 30,000 were originally sampled for the first round of this survey. And the interesting thing is that this sample was selected from the administrative labor market data. And that makes it very easy for us to link the survey data back to the administrative labor market data. And so we only focus on this sample because it's so easy for us to link it back to the admin data. Then we focus on respondents and non-respondents of the first 3 waves of this survey, which were collected in from 2006 to 2009. Why 4 years? Well, usually the data is collected like around, I think around Christmas, end of year, beginning of New Year. So yeah, but we focus on the first 3 waves. And we have a 23% on average response rate in the survey. And as we will see on the next slide, or the one after that, this 23% response rate is a challenge here because we need to account for this non-random dropout and due to attrition and initial non-response. And to give you some more information on the admin labor market data, they come from the German Federal Employment Agency, as I already mentioned, and all individuals in Germany who are in employment subject to social security contributions are in this administrative labor market data set, which makes it extremely relevant for the kind of research that we're doing here. What does it mean to be in employment subject to social security contributions? Well, it means that civil servants are not covered. That's basically to somewhat simplify it. If you're like a university professor, if you're a high school teacher, you're a civil servant, you're not in this data set, but everybody who works for private companies is in this data set. And we have information for these individuals about phases of employment, phases of unemployment, benefit receipt, whether they ever registered as a job seeking, for how long, and most importantly for us here is whether they participated in these ALMP, these labor market training programs that I mentioned earlier. And for these people, we have a bunch of social demographic information: age, gender, nationality. We have information on their labor market histories, like episodes of unemployment, episodes of employment, benefit receipt, job search, all these kind of information. And why episodes? Well, it's basically a longitudinal data set. Every time you enter a new status, you get a new entry in the database. And we use that information and merge it to the survey data later on. And as I mentioned, the past recipient sample is selected from the admin data, which makes it very easy for us to link it back. By law, we need to ask participants whether they agree that we merge their survey data with the admin data. However, since here we are only taking survey response indicators from the survey data and matching it to the admin data, we can somewhat sidestep this limitation that we need to ask for a linkage consent. And yeah, having talked so much about this data linkage, how did it actually work? Well, we identified respondents and non-respondents, and this is very important for this paper, in the admin labor market data. And overall, we were able to link about 95% of respondents. There are some errors, but overall, like 95%, nearly everyone. And then, as I just said, we use only the admin data and a response indicator taken from the survey data. So we have labor market behavior as measured in the admin data, which are independent of respondents reporting. And then we merged in an indicator whether and how often people participated in the first three waves of the survey. And this allows us to tackle this first challenge, disentangling changes in behavior from changes in reporting of behavior, because we look only at the admin data, which is independent of respondents reporting. As a byproduct, somewhat, that also eliminates confounding errors due to mode or interviewer effects, because they would also just affect response quality. But since we have the admin data, we do not need to worry about response quality. And that is a very useful design, because we can get rid of all these additional errors. However, that still leaves us with the problem of non-response and attrition. If you go back, we have on average 23% response rate, and we have attrition as non-random dropout from survey participation over time. And so the design that we used here is, first of all, we think of participation in the survey as a treatment. And if you're familiar with the causal inference literature, you know, well, you have your treatment group, you have your control group, and usually you compare the treatment group to the control group. And if you have a randomly drawn, then you get your treatment effects and unbiased estimates of the treatment effect. However, in our case, we take the treatment group, which is the full past sample, so respondents and non-respondents. Now, the problem is, well, we know only if treatment is actual participation in the survey, then actually only respondents were treated and non-respondents were not treated. So what we think of this scenario here in the treatment group is we have non-compliance with the treatment. Some people were selected to participate in the survey to get the treatment, but they decided to not take the treatment, so to non-comply with their assigned treatment status. And the control group that we used is, well, since the original survey sample was selected from the admin records, what we could do is we could just go back in time to the original sample selection point, like go back in time in the data, say to, I think the sample was selected in 2005, specify a second sample that was designed just the same way as the past sample, and select a second sample of people who were eligible to be sampled for the survey sample, but were never selected. Overall, the data, there are millions of people, so selecting a second sample is super easy. Same sampling specifications selected at the retrospectively same point in time. And so we have our treatment group, the survey sample, where we have respondents and non-respondents, this non-compliance problem, and we have the control group, which looks just like the treatment group. And now to identify the hopefully unbiased treatment effect of survey participation, or repeated survey participation, because we want to estimate a panel conditioning effect, we need to somehow get rid of this non-compliance problem. So the some people in the past sample deciding not to participate in the survey. And so our identification strategy here is based on an instrumental variable approach. And to somehow set the stage, we have our outcome variable, which is two different measures. One is whether people participated in any training measure at all, which is just the binary indicator, after the first round of the survey, after the second round of the survey, and after the third round of the survey. So we have actually three Ys, binary Ys. Then we have an alternative specification where we have the number of participation. So how many ALMP they participated in. And then a very naive approach would be, well, instead of comparing respondents with the control group, we take the past sample and the control group, so the treatment group and the control group, and ignore this non-compliance problem. We just keep everyone in there and calculate this intention to treat effect. What we will see is that the effect is, like from a statistical side, is too small relative to the average treatment effect on the treated, because, well, non-compliance, they didn't take the treatment, and so there's no effect. And somewhat the true treatment effect is watered down by these people who haven't taken the treatment. But this is unbiased, because the two samples were selected with the exact same specifications. And to account for this non-response problem now, or this non-compliance with treatment, we use the random selection into the treatment sample, the past survey sample, or the control group. We use it as an instrument for actual take-up of the treatment. So compliance with being invited to the survey. And that allows us to overcome bias due to non-compliance and non-response. And if you know the instrumental variable approach literature, you know that this is like this is an heterogeneous treatment effect. And we speak of it as a local average treatment effect because it usually only is identified for compliers. That is for people who have actually taken the treatment, and the group is somewhat difficult to identify. In our case, however, the local average treatment effect is identical to the average treatment effect on the treated, because people who were not invited to the interview could not participate in the interview. And so we can eliminate this one term from the estimator, and then our late becomes the ATT. And the idea is we take the intention to treat effect and scale it by the response rate. So this is just the response rate in the survey. So in a way, this is a first stage. the first stage regression, if you know the IV lingo. So we have a 23% response rate on average, and we scale this attention to treat effect with a response rate. And that gives us the average treatment effect on the treated. We need some identification assumptions. We need independence of the instrument. This is given because the selection into the pass or treatment group and the control group was randomly determined. We need exclusion of the instrument, and that means that selection into pass had no other effect apart from the instrument. And we need a first stage, which means we need a response rate larger than 0, and monotonicity, which means that people, in this case, not selected for pass, could not participate in the survey. This is obviously holds in our case, and the stable unit treatment value assumption as in many of those scenarios. Now let's look at the results. First, we have the intention to treat effect. After wave 1, we see the number of LMP participations, it tends to become positive. After wave 2, it gets a little bit larger. After wave 3, it gets even larger. But on the scale, it's very, very small. So this is 0.1 of 1 ALMP measure, so it's super small. When we look at the binary participation indicator, we see that, say, about 2% after wave 3 participated. The probability to participate in any ALMP was about 2% higher in the treatment group than in the control group. And actually, as somewhat of a pre-treatment test, we also look at the outcome before the actual survey happened. From the data, we can also look at labor market behavior before the first wave of the survey, and we see that here the effect is not distinguishable from 0. But the effect, as I said, is too small because we have this we have people who didn't take the treatment in there. And now we look at the local average treatment effect, or the average treatment on the treated in our case. Again, before wave 1, no difference from 0. That is what we want, because if it is indistinguishable from 0, it means that there are no differences between those who have participated in the survey and those who haven't, and that is how it should be. But after wave 1, we see that the effect becomes positive and increases in size. And when we now look at the effect size, it's after wave 3, it's about nearly 0.2. And when we look at the ALMP participation indicator, we see that having participated in up to 3 waves of the survey made on average people about 7 percentage points more likely to participate in any ALMP measure. And this is what we interpret as evidence of panel conditioning in terms of changes in behavior. So, summary and some thoughts maybe for the discussion later on. Past respondents' take-up of ALMP increased after repeated interviewing, which is evidence for panel conditioning. These estimates are not biased by respondents' reporting, non-response, panel attrition, mode interview effects, and all these things that I identified earlier as problematic for identification strategy. And yeah, some practical implications. Inference made based on this survey data set may be biased because we have changes in behavior. The survey population is no longer representative of the target population because their behavior has changed. And yeah, we see repeated interviewing has an effect on respondents' actual behavior. And with that, I'll conclude and hand back to you, Alex.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Again, really nice design and analysis. So very nice to be able to separate these different types of effects. So any quick questions before we go to the last talk and the discussion? Yeah, we have a question. Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering about the ALMP participation, the graphs you put up there. You said it was as a percentage. Does that mean you're taking that cumulatively? So it's with each wave, you're counting how many people have participated at all over the course of every wave? Or is it,
Yes,
are we
that's
dropping
correct.
people who are in between finding jobs?
No, that's your interpretation was correct. So cumulative in terms of how many people have after each wave participated in at least one ALMP measure.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I think we can move on to the last presentation. So Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sharing my screen here. Okay, you can use my, yeah, you can see my screen. Okay, good. Okay. Sorry. Trying to configure my screen here a little bit. Okay. Good. So thanks, Alex, for having me and allowing to talk a little bit about panel conditioning, maybe from a different perspective compared to the other two speakers. I want to introduce or propose here a new method of better understanding panel conditioning in web service by using digital trace data. I'll talk a little bit more about digital trace data is in a second. I want to acknowledge, so this is was a collaboration or is a collaboration that Alex and I have been working on. We were lucky to receive some funding to do this work together, and there is a paper out there that describes the data and what we were doing in much more detail than what I can do here in this next 15 minutes or so. So I invite you to take a look at that or ask for clarification questions. Now comes the repetitive part, right? So you have heard this a couple of times already, so I'll browse through this rather quickly. Maybe highlighting here that I will focus really on the aspect of change in behavior, right? So that asking respondents questions may really lead to change in behavior outside of the survey. And that, of course, is a threat to the inference we make from the survey data, especially when we talk about longitudinal studies. I think this hasn't been mentioned. There's different terms that have been used in the literature for these type of things, mirror measurement effects and things like that. So they usually describe, I think, the same phenomenon. And Ruben has talked at length about this, both in his in introductory remarks, that there is evidence that this is a problem. We've heard about the voting examples, right? But there's even purchase behavior, right? I think there's even a study that claims that if you ask people about whether they intend to buy new cars, they're more likely to buy a car in the next year. And of course, we have seen the labor market participation example that Ruben has presented. I want to focus here on a little bit on the underlying theory here that I will use to explain some of the results that we found. The cognitive stimulus hypothesis that I think Ruben also mentioned in the beginning, that if you ask someone about a topic they haven't thought about, that they start crystallizing an opinion on this topic. There's other explanations that also Ruben mentioned, right? That I'm not gonna talk too much about here. Also, Ruben has at length mentioned that this is really not a trivial thing to disentangle the change in behavior from the behaviors that are measured and how they are measured, right? And he has mentioned that there's different ways of trying to disentangle this, and one ideal thing is that you have an alternative data source available that doesn't suffer from this reactivity, that people are kind of like reacting based on the measurement process, right? So we need an outside measure for that. Official turnout figures have been used in voting, or even individual validated voting records. Again, Ruben has presented his work on administrative data here. I want to present an alternative data source that is more novel and might be useful in some cases, and this is what we call digital traces. And they might especially be useful if you think about online survey data collection, right? Where you ask people potentially repeatedly on a topic in a web survey. So what are digital traces? Here, two definitions that I both really like, so I'm using them here. Records of activity, thus trace data undertaken through an online information system, thus digital. Also, people have used this behavior residue of individuals when they interact online. And this online information systems can be the internet, can be other digital systems that collect information. Basically, want to make you aware that whenever you interact with any system that collects data, you leave, of course, a digital footprint at this point, right? And this is what we mean by digital traces. I want to look at this from a researcher perspective, that these data allow us to measure behavior potentially in the moment at very high frequencies. And the advantage here is really that we can see evolution of moment-to-moment changes. And that's an important thing that I want to stress here, that we can really see minuscule changes of what people do online, and therefore we can potentially measure changes in behavior. This can be done without increased burden on participants. We don't have to continuously ask them, right? Which again would be would probably introduce this a panel conditioning effect, and it's very scalable, right? We can do this on a large scale. The measurement happens passively, that is without the direct solicitation of the subjects that we're studying, right? So it happens in the background. People are not affected directly by the measurement, and the measurement is not affected by reactivity. So there shouldn't be a measurement error there. We can discuss this a little bit more maybe in the discussion later on, whether there might be other effects that might be problematic here with this data. And there is quite some literature now out there that really shows that this reduces measurement error compared to self-reports when you think about things such as measuring smartphone use, right? It seems to be that if we measure actual smartphone use through these digital traces, this is much more accurate than asking people about how often they use their smartphone, how much they use certain apps and the like. We see very similar things with online media consumption and even mobility, right? That this type of data is more accurate. How do we get access to this data, right? So here we have to think about that these data need to come, of course, there's a consent process, right? With that, I want to be very clear about this up front. So what we need to do this is we have to find users who install a plugin to their web browser. These are usually called meters or trackers that continuously track the information on what people do online, right? They either extract information from the URLs that someone is visiting. They might also, depending on the technology, collect HTML code or do some type of screen scraping. There's different technologies. I'm not going to talk in detail about the technology here, but they all basically lead to the same outcome, that you get time-stamped information about what websites people visit. Going beyond just website and web browsing on smartphones and tablets and other mobile devices that potentially also have sensors, mobile sensors built into them. If people download an app, research app, you might even get more information about what people do with this device, not only the browsing, but their general use of the device and potential other sensors. Think about GPS, the accelerometer on a smartphone, for example. And again, this allows tracking of individual behavior over longer periods of time. There is a number of commercial and non-commercial tools out there that now can be used to do this, right? You don't have to program an app yourself or media yourself. Here's a couple of companies and organizations that also have a link behind them that provide this type of technology. And more market research companies have started to build up these metered panels. So they, on top of having usually a volunteer non-probability online panel of people who regularly participate in web surveys. On top of that, at least a selection of these online panel participants now have a meter installed on their desktop computer and or smartphone, and therefore you can combine self-reported data with these metered data, right? So NetQuest, the company that does this in Spain and Portugal and South America, Respondibilendi, Gapfish, 2 German companies, and then there's a large international company called Denada. My understanding is that they currently only maintain such a metered panel in the US, but so I'm not 100% sure how the situation is in the UK right now. So with that in mind, what we want to do here in this study, what we want to learn is whether online surveys on politics lead to change in behavior related to online news consumption, right? The hypothesis there would be that if we see panel conditioning, then if people are asked questions about politics, about voting, about political parties, about politicians, they might start either looking up information on those politicians, political parties, or on politics in general. They might be triggered to consume more online news related to these topics. And a second research question that we had is that whether the results of this are moderated by interest in politics and the previous online news consumption behavior, right? So people who are already very much engaged in the topic might be less susceptible to this panel conditioning effect. How did we go about this? We have data from a non-probability online panel in Germany, the Respondibilendi panel. There we have a little over 2,000 people who at that point were eligible to vote in the 2017 German federal election. Prior and around the day of the election, we had 3 waves of survey data. 3 times between August and October, people were asked more or less the same questions on, again, political interest, political engagement, political parties, voting intention, and the like. Each of the 2,000 participants had to complete at least one of the waves. So they were invited, all were invited to all 3 waves. Not everybody participated in all waves. And actually, we're going to take advantage of that fact that some people didn't participate in all the waves. All participants of the 2,000 participants had a mirror installed on at least one laptop, desktop, or one mobile device. We have some people where we track both devices. We have some people where we only have desktop and laptop data, and some where we only have mobile data. So what are the data that we're interested in here? Mainly, we're interested in online news consumption and any information related to German politicians and parties on websites and apps. So in our data set across these 3 months, and you can see here that the timeline between August and October, that's where we have the tracking data. We look at visits to websites, news outlets in Germany, news apps on smartphones, and websites of politicians, of political parties, right? And we look at how often we find this type of entries in the data set, and for how long, how much time people spend on these websites. You can also see in this chart, the black vertical lines are the 3 dates of about the dates of the web survey. So this was when the web survey were sent out. People had around a week or so to participate in the web survey. So this is not necessarily the date that all the participants responded to the web survey, but the 3 black lines are the surveys. The yellow line here around late September is the date of the election, and the blue line here is the date of the big TV debate in Germany. You can see here in red are events frequency of visits to news websites, and the greenish, bluish dots at the bottom are visits to politicians and politics websites. Because we found relatively few visits to these political websites, we aggregated the data, right? We combine news and politics websites for analysis. And again, we look at frequency and duration here. Well, to analyze the data, what we did first is we kind of like collapsed them and standardized the day of and the time point of when an individual participated in a given survey wave, right? So for each person, this is now a relative point here where this person, given their timestamp in the web survey, participated in the web survey. And then for each person, we looked at 3 days before, this is the left-hand side here, and 3 days after the web survey. And we looked at the trace data, right? So 3 days before the web survey happened and the 3 days after the web survey happened, when how often did they go here? And this is the frequency. How often did they go on a given on a website that is of interest for us, or open an app that is of interest for us, right? And you can see this. The 3 different colors are the 3 different waves, and the solid lines are people who participated in a given wave. And remember, not everybody participated in all the waves. So we also have data for people who didn't participate in a given wave. So we have information for that as well. So this is kind of like our control group, if you will. Now, what we're interested in is a comparison of what happens after survey participation. And our first research question, our first hypothesis would be that the gap between people who participated in the survey wave and the people who didn't participate in the wave should widen, right? This would be an indication for that the survey participation triggers going on a news website or looking up information online on politics. Our modeling approach is that we use the regression discontinuity design with fixed effects and controls for the things that varied for the individuals, right? So this is the day of the week of when we have data, the time of the day, whether the data were collected on the debate day or the election day, because we saw that there are certain spikes there. Remember, we pooled politics links and news links, so we had an indicator for that. We had indicators for wave and what device people actually used, or from what device the data collection came from. Again, we compare the survey respondents and non-respondents 3 days prior and 3 days after participating in a survey. For the first research question, we're really interested in the interaction effect between survey participation and the period after the survey. Again, this is what I mentioned with if we would find panel conditioning, the gap would widen after the survey participation. For our second research question, again, this is the moderating effect of previous news consumption and political interest. We had a 3-way interaction there with the survey participation and the period, and whether people were heavy previous news and politics consumers. So we looked at actually their data prior to participating in the first wave, were those people who are very much engaged already in the topic. And similarly, we used an indicator there for political interest, self-reported political interest. Yeah, that brings us to the results. I can be relatively quick here with our outcome. On average, we didn't find an effect, right? So no significant difference in news and politics consumptions between respondents and non-respondents in the period after the survey. So no widening of this gap. This is true both for the frequency and the log duration. However, we find that people with previous high news and politics consumptions were less likely to be influenced by an effect of participation in the survey, or turned the other way around. Those people who were not highly news and politics people who consumed news and politics a lot, there we found a small but significant effect of survey participation. So for them, there was an increase here. This is only true for the frequency of news and politics consumption, not for the duration, right? So people were then more likely, but didn't participate, didn't look at these websites and apps longer. And we didn't find an interaction effect for political interest. So what does this mean? What are the conclusions from what we're drawing here? So first of all, we think that the digital trace data offers really a possibility to investigate behavioral change on different topics. We have here news consumptions. You could think about other topics with very high precision. You could see really with these timestamps we have from the web survey, plus the timestamps we have from all the entries of where people go to on websites, we really can see even small changes, right? And this would allow us to identify direct influence of online survey participation on behavior outside of the survey in the online world. Participation in multiple surveys about politics does not change people's online news and politics consumption behavior on the average, right? We see some evidence that respondents with high news and politics media consumption are less influenced by survey participation as opposed to people who show less news and politics media consumption in the beginning. Again, this is pretty much in line with our cognitive stimulus hypothesis, right? If you think about this from the low news and politics and media consumption, these are probably people who are not that engaged with the topic yet, and here this potentially triggered this behavior. Overall, what we also see or take away from this is that panel conditioning and reactivity might potentially be less of a problem in election studies on political polling in these online panels, right? And this is definitely some of a limitation, I would say, here with our study, is that we have an online panel of volunteers. This is a selective group of people. They potentially participate in a lot of surveys on different topics. And the stimulus of participating in one or let it be 3 political surveys might just not be strong enough to change behavior outside of the survey, which is, I would say, good news, right? If you're an online panel provider, because then, or someone who consumes this type of data, because then participation in the survey probably didn't trigger that much of a change. A couple of words about the quality of the digital trace data. Please bear in mind, these are not error-free. Right? Although this is very precise data, we are very much aware of the fact that we are potentially missing some information. Users can temporarily turn off the data collection. They can just like shut the app down. They can delete the browser plugin, or they can use alternative browsers or alternative devices to engage in certain behaviors that we are not collecting. So it's not a perfect measurement, but it's, I would say, a very as good as it gets at the moment. Also, a little bit methodological. There's the measure that we're using here is a very crude measure of news consumption. We took any type of news outlet that or German news outlet that we could classify. With much more effort, we could also there's a way to look more into detail about specific news contents, right? We could classify specific news articles, right, that are then more tailored. Actually, Ruben has done quite some work on this as well, which again then is much more effort. So we think this is an interesting new way of trying to unveil this panel conditioning effects in online service, and I'm pretty much looking forward to questions or comments and potentially seeing other applications of this in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Florian. So any questions for Florian? And we have time for longer questions or more general questions if you have them. If not for Florian, for anyone else? So to get us started, I have a question for Fabienne. So I mean, one thing that I'm interested in is a lot of research in panel conditioning looks at data that is collected every year, and we're moving to shorter periods like monthly, quarterly, 3 months. So I really liked your design that you had 1 month and 3 months. And I was wondering how comparable it is with, what we found in other studies where we have monthly data collection, for example. I know you did this comparison with GESIS, but it's not really like to like because you have different types of samples and so on. So do you have any thoughts about that? So how would you think this affects would look like in something like a yearly panel, like PASS, for example?
Okay, first of all, I would like to clarify something maybe that was not so clear during my presentation. So the comparison that we had with the GESIS panel was just like for the GESIS panel, only like a one-time measurement, as like the measures that we used weren't included in further waves. So there we have really just like this one-time measurement comparison. But yeah, that's actually an interesting thought, Alex. I think like why we specifically wanted to keep the interval between panel waves quite short is that we were interested in, I mean, of course, we wanted to make sure that we still find effects, as like prior research has shown that like the longer you the interval between panel waves is, of course, like the less likely it is to find effects, as respondents, I don't know, might not be aware so much of the questionnaires or the surveys that they filled in before. So we wanted to make sure that we still have these awareness and the memory of respondents of prior waves. So I think this is why we chose it's still kind of like a smaller interval of 2 to 3 months, and then I compare it to an even shorter interval. And I think we even chose this because I'm not sure, but I think the development and like especially like in web surveys is like into the direction of like, yeah, shorter intervals between panel waves. So we also wanted to address that. So I think, of course, you should be very careful in comparing it to, for example, longitudinal surveys that like have a longer interval between panel waves, because of course that's always that's always something to pay attention to. But I think, I mean, we did not see an effect of panel interval in our study as well. So maybe that also gives an idea about how much we should pay attention to the interval in general.
Yeah, so we can think maybe this is a lower bound. So if you have more time, maybe you'd expect even less of an effect. Just kind of to continue that, and then we can go to Henning. I was thinking for what Ruben found, like what would be the opposite if the IAB would collect data monthly instead of yearly? What would be your expectation? Do you think those effects would get bigger and this would be a more important issue? So, Ruben, any thoughts about that?
That's a very good question, and I know that the IAB has implemented its own online access panel in response to developments due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not aware that they have done research on this topic. I don't know, Florian, maybe you've heard of some research, but I guess this could be super interesting to look into. And I mean, I guess for topics such as labor market behavior, if you're constantly bugged with questions about your labor market status, about your like things you do to find a new job in short time, and participating in training measures, writing job applications, then I think it's reasonable to at least assume that there could be going something on. And if you increase the as one of the hypotheses that Fabienne presented, if you increase the frequency and intensity of these questions, then I'm sure there's at least good reason to believe that it is more likely to expect such effects in this labor market setting.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So yeah, it might be useful there to think of desires, right? Like rotating monthly or something to deal with this kind of issues. Cool. So Henning, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for this, all the great presentations. I have two questions, actually. One for Ruben. I was wondering whether you consider to look into long-term effects of your treatment. Maybe people took even more part in those programs, or even like they came back into the labor market or something like that. And for Florian, did you also look into it seems like if I understand it, stood it right, you looked more like if they changed their news consumption in general, and whether you had like specific questions about certain news outlets or things people might feel emotional about, when maybe they looked that more up or followed that more closely.
Yes. So actually, we also looked at the time it takes people to find a new job, because at recruitment, people were most of the people were in unemployment, or they had at least had at maximum like a what's called a mini job, which is like you work a couple of hours and you can earn back then up to 400 euros per month. So not really a regular employment. And we also looked at time it takes to find a new regular job, but we didn't find any effects. I mean, it would be interesting also to follow up on this work, because we only looked at the first 3 waves. At some point, we also looked at the first 6 waves, but then there was a new recruitment round. But now the panel is in its 15th round. And I guess it would be super interesting to see how people who have been in the panel for such a long time, how their labor market outcomes have evolved. And I think, and I don't want to talk too much, but I think there's some studies, maybe something like Millennium study, where cohorts of people have been interviewed like basically for 30 years, only like every 5 or 10 years. And I don't know if there's any research out there, but that would be super interesting to look how the survey experience for such a long time has affected their lives.
Yeah, and to your question about the different news outside, I agree 100% with your sentiment. So what we did is we used a list of the 50 most popular news outlets in Germany at the point of time, right? And that's what I mean is meant with it's a very crude measure of news consumption in this context, right? Because this could have been any type of news, right? On that outlet, right? And as I mentioned, Ruben in his other life also deals a lot with this data, and he has done quite some work on looking into the more details of the URLs and what's behind this. We haven't done this for this study, right? There is a way, but it's a lot of work, right? I don't know if you want to say more about this, Ruben, but it's a little bit much more tricky, right, to identify exactly what is behind a URL, right? Like what's the content of a website, and then is this a polarizing topic, right? And we were really interested in kind of like in a general news politics behavior.
I would add that we did that for politics, right? Because there were these questions that were about particular politicians and parties, and we thought that's easier to see if they actually go to the website of that party or politician. So that's an example where we actually went through the website of those and looked for any link that has those names or acronyms. But like we saw, there were very few politics links in the end. So all that work for nothing.
So that we asked, I think the survey asked about 10 politicians and 7 different parties. So we really looked at those specific party websites, those, I think, Wikipedia entries of those politicians and stuff like that. But as Alex said, compared to the news, as you saw, compared to the news entries, there's much less traffic on these websites.
So there's a question from Nick in the chat. So if I understand correctly, he's kind of trying to compare what you see in psychology, for example, with practice effects or in cognitive testing versus what we typically find in panel conditioning. And I was wondering if anyone has any thoughts about that. And it would be worth mentioning that we didn't look at this, right? Because we have like factual questions or in surveys, and we could expect different types of conditioning in those situations, but none of us, at least in what we presented, looked at that. So does anyone have any thoughts about how this compares with practice effects, or how this could affect knowledge questions, for example? Nick, I think you found a good research topic.
I just want to mention that we haven't done this, but I think there are studies out there that, again, use digital trace data to see whether people are looking up, for example, specific information on the internet on a knowledge question, right? And I think Jan Höhne has done some work on, for example, whether people in a web survey, if you ask a knowledge question about a specific policy, for example, that people look up the Wikipedia page, for example, on that topic. So there is a little bit of research on this, especially on knowledge questions.
Thank you. So there's a question from
Florian.
Michael.
And thanks to all the presenters. I have a question to all of you. So, and it's a bit connected to the question by Nick on cognitive tests, because every year I'm planning to do something in this direction, panel conditioning with the share data, and we have collected data on age cap, so really cognitive measures for older people. But actually, your presentations today were not very motivating to do this, because you weren't found much. So what is the reason for this? So what should we do to I don't know, find a bit more of these panel conditioning effects? And I was surprised that you did not find much, actually.
I mean, my reading at least is we have a variation, right? So it seems from what Fabienne was presenting is kind of this measurement error. It seems maybe that's not an issue, but at the other extreme, you have what Ruben found, that behavior does change. And just kind of brainstorming, I do think cognitive questions are different, because you can actually learn them to some degree, and you can, if you think of like the chapter of Patrick Sturgis and colleagues, you see like, yeah, people learn about the environment and they start to read more about it, and they're kind of interested in it, and maybe they start doing this training for brains and become better at cognitive tests. So I do think maybe it wouldn't, what we saw today wouldn't necessarily tell you what to expect with cognitive tests. At least that's kind of, I think maybe the mechanism would be slightly different there. I'm not sure what others think.
I mean, I'm pretty sure there must be something in the more like psychological literature on like retest reliability, and I mean, for the share survey, as you mentioned, I guess aging and cognitive skills testing would probably be very difficult, like to disentangle what is really like learning, what is effects that you're interested in, not in terms of panel conditioning, but aging and maybe decreases in cognitive skills. And so figuring out a good design for that is probably challenging. But I guess if someone had the money, the budget, or the capacity to plan something, then a rotating design would probably be the most promising, in my opinion, to test something like that.
Or at least a refreshment sample.
Yeah.
That might be easier to get. Yeah, Fabienne or Florian, any thoughts? No.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I do think it's a really important topic, right? Because cognition and aging is such a key topic, and measuring it well is very difficult. I think it's worth thinking how to do it. The other thing is also, if you move to web surveys or something like that, might be worth thinking if you can use pair data, things like if they look things up or how long it takes to answer questions and things like that. again, I'm not sure if you can have this really clean designs that Ruben discussed and Fabienne showed us, but it would give us some insight if you can use some of these kind of new forms of data like paradata or digital trade data. Again, more open questions than answers. So I think Henning put some links in the chat about that as well, so maybe you can have a look at that. So other questions, thoughts, dilemmas? Fabienne, I want to ask you, I think this is relevant. So if I understood correctly, your paper is part of a special issue. Is that correct? Do you want to say a little bit about what journal, when it should appear and so on? Because I think the people who are here might be interested in that as well.
Unfortunately, I can't say much about when it's going to be appearing, but it is a special issue of survey research methods on generally methodological innovations in panel studies. So I think it's not only on panel conditioning in particular, but it has like a broader spectrum or broader frame. But unfortunately, I can't say when it's gonna appear.
Okay, so it was survey research methods. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. So Michael?
Oh, yes. My job involves television monitoring. We have a panel of households with a monitor attached to their television. And in many countries, they say, we want the panel to rotate. We want nobody to be on the panel more than 5 years, or we want 20% of the panel to be thrown off every year. And I've always said that's not a good idea because it's difficult to recruit more people. What would you say to countries that demand this sort of rotation?
Yeah. Let's see, Ruben. I think Ruben has some thoughts, but
well, I guess like from the panel conditioning perspective, if you have this rotating design where you always have groups with different panel tenure in there, it's super interesting and a very rich data set to explore all these kind of effects. And then if you have some empirical evidence, you could probably provide some answers to the people who demand that to have more rotation. Because, I mean, if you find effects, then you could say, well, it's important to have more rotation in there. If you don't find effects, then yeah. But I think for me, it would be most interesting from the like data perspective and the research designs that are possible.
Right. Thank you.
I mean, the other thing that we should mention is also that there's a trade-off, right? Like panel conditioning is just one of the small things you need to consider. So yeah, this is an issue or might not be an issue, but then, like you said, well, you need to recruit people, you need to give them incentives. There are other types of measurement error that we did not discuss. So I think also your point makes sense that, well, maybe panel conditioning is not such a big issue compared to non-response or compared to how much it costs to recruit some new people. And yeah, actually we don't have lots of evidence on that, like looking at all of these. I don't know, the total survey error is around for a long time, but we're still struggling to put together all these different types of evidence and figure out, okay, what's the best trade-off.
And I'm like adding to that, I guess in the end, panel conditioning is, for me, it was my whole dissertation. It's super interesting to study, but in the end, it's probably one of the sources of error that is, as Alex said, more on the interesting to know. Somebody should look at it, but probably not as important as like drawing a good sample that is representative of your population, because you have a probability sampling design, or waiting for non-response, or asking questions in ways that reduce measurement error, not messing up studies by having sudden breaks in modes and all these kind of things. And I guess really it's a very niche topic, but a very interesting one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, thoughts? I see something in the chat. Oh, there's another paper in the chat for people who are interested. Henning, do you have another one?
Yes, I think there are certain cases that can be quite large. So I know, for instance, that in one panel study, in I think Perfarm, they had to take a question about a network generator out because people tried or started to answer that systematically, but so they didn't say they know so many people. So I don't think that relates to general attitude questions or so on. But in some cases, it can really be a concern for panel studies.
Yeah, and there are also other types of learning, right? Like the filtering. If you know, okay, if I say yes, I'm going to get 100 questions on, the jeans I bought, and then you learn not to answer yes. And that's another type of conditioning we didn't really discuss too much today.
I think also Stephanie Ackman, she did some work using some, maybe it was the consumer expenditure survey, where she really looked into, okay, what is, how large is the effect of conditioning on like outcomes in spending, and try to really, not just have this crude, well, there's a significant effect, but to really measure it in relationship to the outcomes that are actually taken from the survey. So maybe that could be of interest to the audience here.
Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts before we call it a day? Well, let's thank again the speakers. I really thought they were very interesting topics, really diverse as well, seeing admin data, cool experimental design and surveys, digital trace data. So RSS will record this and put it online, so you can also later on, after it's published, you can share it with your colleagues. And I'm sure the speakers are happy to be contacted if you have more questions on this. So until I see you next time, everyone stay safe and take care.